Hi, David. Thank you for coming.
Yeah,
And you're going to talk about 10 lessons from the life of David
a
Langwallner,
career, I suppose.
career and life. And let's start with innocence. What do you think about innocence?
Um, I suppose the notion of innocence has become a very complicated notion. Uh, at one level, it is that I, as was trained in no fashion way as a barrister to believe in the burden of proof, presumption of innocence beyond all reasonable doubt. Being a barrister was a truth-seeking process, and the process was to elicit the truth and to work at it. And of course, also, I was educated within a tradition which is dying out very fast, which is the tradition of public speaking in the debating societies of the world, where the question was always, let's get to the bottom of this. If someone says something that's nonsense or untrue or semi-factual, let us crucify them. And within that tradition, which I was very successful within, and there are many others, including Mr. Gove, who's now standing Prime Minister, there was a belief that if someone said something that was utterly wrong, semi-fact, then you destroyed them. Now that's dying out because of questions of balance coverage, questions of one point of view is as good as another in our post-truth universe. But I suppose it was that commitment to the notion of innocence at one level that led me in Ireland in 2009 to the Innocence Project and the request that ultimately a proposal on my behalf to set up the Irish Innocence Project. And ultimately as well to initiate the idea for the European Innocence Network. And the Innocence Project is an organisation set up in 1993 by Barry Scheck and Peter Nuffield, America, now worldwide, dealing with questions of miscarriage of justice, which is effectively when people have been wrongfully incarcerated. There was someone just the other day serving prison for 33 years for a crime they didn't commit. And the Innocence Project, now this was always there from Voltaire, who campaigned for much of the end of his life against miscarriage of justice, through people like Gareth Pearce and Michael Mansfield. There was always a belief in the idea that the system gets things wrong, and then procedures, statutory and otherwise, were built in to deal with when we get things wrong. What the Innocence Project internationally has done is put all of this on a scientific footing and to work out why things go wrong in the first place. And that ultimately led to, in Ireland, as far as I was concerned, my and Tertius Van Eden securing of the exoneration of Harry Gleeson, who had been executed many years ago, or propelling the idea of a DNA right of post-conviction testing for the purposes of establishing whether someone's DNA was correctly on the scene. But much more worrying than that, I've written several papers about it, is not so much those isolated achievements, and one of them led to me being made Lawyer of the Year a couple of years ago in Ireland, but much more worrying than all of that is examining the question of all the things that go wrong in the criminal justice system, which is frankly a mess. And it's all to do with things such as, for example, it's culture specific at one level. I mean, historically the West Yorkshire police, aspects of the Metropolitan Police in Britain were very bad, but nothing quite prepares you for the banditry, criminality, stupidity and idiocy of the Irish police, getting worse in our dumbed down universe as they become more subliterate and puggish. And the layers of assumptions that go into things on their complete lack of training and education, well, merely a reflection of complete lack of standards in Ireland in general, but leaving that aside, then you've got this very nefarious prosecutorial mindset. I think Ireland, you see it in Britain though as well, has inherited from America this zealous win at all costs. Americans often use it, sexually clean neoliberal religious maniacs, um, parts of the deep south, the Midwest particularly, full of these sort of nonsense people. But you see them all in Ireland at the moment, particularly members of the established Fine Gael family, related members of the establishment, full of fury and fervour, based on their own stupidity and idiocy, going after people for the sake of it. And the state is also inculpated in all of this. And then people lose a sense of perspective and track over everything. And then you have questions of the DNA testing issue, which we've mentioned. DNA tests 20 years ago were completely wrong, Neanderthal. Cognitive and confirmatory bias, which are questions of jumping to conclusions. We're all capable of it in any walk in life. I mean, quite apart from the fact that I start basically from the presupposition that every police officer in Ireland is an idiot, or a criminal, or a combination of both. The fact of the matter is they're an idiot within an idiot system. And so the fact is that if you're all like rats in a cage, products of our upbringing, and cognitive bias is merely the ability among an idiot to recognize you are an idiot. So if you're the thinking police officer, if such a thing exists, then perhaps you can come to the conclusion, well, maybe, dumb, I didn't fully understand this. And maybe that thought process floats across some of their minds, apart from. But we're all, whether we're in a corporate culture or a criminal defense lawyers, putting the finger on myself, are a bit like that as well. Everyone's innocent. Well, no, they aren't. But over time, perhaps you're conditioned to think that way. So cognitive or confirmatory bias is another issue. Very disturbing is the exportation of interrogation techniques and manipulation of memory, including, for example, falsely implanted memory systems, which they play with children and vulnerable witnesses. And when I say they, these are techniques that, of course, were used by the Secret Services and the FBI and CIA. You're not being conspiratorial saying this is absolutely true. And now they use it for the manipulation of people's memory or suggestive questioning, or this awfulness that's creeping into our culture. And I did a CPD session in London about cross-examining vulnerable witnesses. Yeah. Well, now I played along with the CPD session, passed it, and was very soft in a vulnerable witness question. But my view is, I'm going to crucify you if necessary. Sorry, I don't believe in liars being protected on bogus victimhood or vulnerability when they're lying. And this soft skill nonsense, which is creeping into teaching as well. Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody's entitled to be an idiot. No, they're not. They're not entitled. William Burroughs said opinions are like assholes. Everyone's got one. And you're not entitled, or as Chris Richards said famously, if you disagree with me, stand in line so I can kick your ass. You're not entitled to have a view if you're an idiot police officer in a 3-week course. You're not entitled to issue a complaint if it's bollocks. You shouldn't be in any position of authority in the first place. So these are other things that go wrong. Confessions, false confessions. People are put in structures or systems where they're vulnerable and they're asked suggestive questionings, or they have low self-esteem. So they go, well, I'll say what I want. I'll sing like a canary until I walk out of this place. So all of these and other factors, the Innocence Project has evaluated, and they've worked out how people are convicted falsely. And it's been a significant chunk of my life. But I think since you asked the question most directly about my commitment to innocence, I'd argue it's other things as well. I suppose it's because I grew up what Hugo Hamilton would call one of the speckled people in Ireland, half Irish, half Austrian, got not given things I should have been, not won competitions, always a perpetual outsider. If you're always the outside looking in, you're always an observer in any culture. It's a very vulnerable position, but over time, you become more antenna-like and more astute in observing local practices. I mean, I suppose I look at much of the Irish legal fraternity the way David Attenborough might look at Eskimos or something like that. You do look at the outside in. Who are you silly people? And now you have to caution yourself against excessive levels of judgmentalism in that context. But being one of the speckled people in Ireland, being the victim of injustices myself, of course you're very attuned to it. And being an outsider and being half Austrian, you're attuned to questions of racism. And we're living in, of course, a neoliberal racist age, and Hungary and Italy are very good examples of this. But Ireland's neoliberal toxic storm is, again, a toxic combination of racism, extreme right-wing Catholicism, and the hatred and hostility towards the outside, the demonization of the outsider, often used against Slavic and Jewish communities and so on, but now extending to anybody who's outside of the norm. So I've always believed in that, but in terms of Ireland, what happened after or during the whole Innocence project was that people came to me as a lawyer and they said, well, I'm innocent too. I've been screwed over by the system in this other way. And if you deal with neoliberalism, the major problem is equality and the cartelization of the world into 1%. Now, if we look at this in a deep structured way, before we get to the questions of my representations of various people, the world had an economic collapse in 2008. Ireland had a double whammy of its own economic collapse to the point of bankruptcy. A lot of people tried to resolve it, didn't, and did so in a very unsatisfactory way. I'm not blaming all of them, but whatever. If you look at two conflicting responses at that point in time, Iceland also had a double whammy. It nationalized the banks, jailed the toxic bankers, reintroduced Rooseveltian social democracy, and it's now stable. We did in Voltaire Panglossy in terms of the worst of all possible things. We set up a money laundering bank for failed rich people, so they got their debts written off in a criminal bandit third world way, orchestrated through the courts by lawyers beneath contempt with the support of the Supreme Court, called NAMA, the National Asset Management Association. Basically a trust fund for mega-rich failed property speculators, bankers, and lawyers, or those that weren't appointed to the courts, inflicted austerity through the ECB on the plain people of Ireland to the point of bankruptcy, upheld the toxic banks which caused all the problems by proxy from Goldman Sachs. And don't forget, the citadel of Irish wisdom, Peter Sutherland, was chairman of Goldman Sachs, the most nefarious, corrupt, criminal entity in the world. And these people, lunatics, then convince people that they're entitled to be exonerated. Let's you think I'm talking nonsense. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, said it's socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. You pay for our mistakes in the interest of the destabilization we caused in the first place. And the fact that people are so compliant in our brave new world and actually believing any of this bullshit defies description. So the net effect when I come in representative terms in Ireland is when they come to me, well, we're innocent to it. Who are you? Well, we're a farmer about to commit suicide or someone about to be repossessed for being derelict in their mortgage repayments. Now, this nonsense, Greeks must honour their debts. Polonius, Hamlet, neither a borrower nor a lender be. Not really. Why did you borrow in the first place? What were you told by Goldman Sachs or the semi-literate Amanesis bankers? How did they vary their mortgage interest repayments? Did they leave the country, as Danske Bank did, once they hiked it up 4%? What did they lie about in the contract? Why didn't they revert to ECB rates? And why are the courts upholding all of this? Well, they're part of it, aren't they? The law firms, commercial law firms in Ireland, are just dedicated towards the lubrications of multinational capitalism, tax breaks, and upholding of the interests of the rich. And they appoint some of the judges, or by proxy they do. So legal doctrine is bent and manipulated. Now, of course, that does not exonerate people who over-leverage to the point of borrowing millions. And some of them I've represented, but I'm skeptical of their motivations. But I'm not skeptical about the damage done to ordinary people. And I'm not skeptical at all about the layers of hypocrisy of judges marred in debt and financial compromise, doing deals with banks and NAMA, sitting in judgment over people and throwing them out in the street, and stopping the master of the Irish High Court, that they've done recently, from preventing this process. So at one level, my commitment of innocence has morphed into the concept of, really, I think it is a question of people are sheep. And if you interact with criminal institutions, states, police forces, social workers, banking institutions, or authority figures, the instinct, I suppose, from people of a certain generation is to believe that someone in authority should be there. My instinct is to believe they shouldn't be there at all now at this stage. And my instinct is certainly not to believe anything they say, or not to take anything they say at face value, because I've seen so many innocent people in that sense walk into situations where they're destroyed. I think there's another thing, which I took a lot of writing, and since you asked me in the first segment of this about conceptions of innocence, you can empower yourself against being innocent. We are all at given levels, the spectral timber of humanity, innocent in some respect. We all have strengths, weaknesses, and things we're good at and not good at, for example. I mean, I can't change a light bulb. I can't drive a car properly. In that sense, I'm innocent of this. But the question of innocence in a larger sense is, how do you avoid being exploited? How do you not walk into a situation where you're going to get crucified? Now, it was the case, and still is, that education, literacy, knowledge, both professional and larger, is important, and it arms you against things, I think. It's also the case that, at least when I was growing up, education provides you with self-critical tools. I think, so many people are just absorbing information that one of the functions of education, growth of habit, is to liberate the intellect and the civilized mind, which is skeptical. Skepticism is intrinsic to all of this. And say, well, why do you say that when you say that? And of course, the criminal defense bars, which I'm part of, is, well, what do you mean when you say what you mean? What are you saying now when you're saying what you're saying? Or what are you trying to say? In other words, don't passively endorse what people in authority think of you or say to you. Politely rebuke and disagree with them. And then sometimes, if they're not being reasonable and understanding what they're doing, well, the alternatives are very clear. Crucify them. And I think I've been launching a campaign against various aspects of Irish society. And thankfully, a lot of people, the innocents, are saying I've been right about it, and I have been. Because in the post-truth universe, I want to go back to that, people are being fed what Zizek, the Slavic philosopher, called ideological misidentification. They're being fed a pack of lies, and they're buying it wholesale. And of course, the media control in Ireland is mostly, or they're so compromised they won't report what's really going on, or they're so cushy that their level of compassion only extends so far. And innocence is understanding, I think, that you need to empower yourself against a world order in neoliberal countries, which is based on screwing you economically, working you too hard, giving you short-term contracts, not looking after you, looking at you as a dispensable objective commodity or an object for exploitation. And it's what a lot of people talk in terms of the rewiring of human identity. So maybe we should be giving people skills in university to cope with that without being an exploiter. This veneration, American origin, of money and bigness and growth and expansion has created a neo-Nazi quasi-fascist monster like Steve Bannon building mausoleums in Italy to brainwash people, and hoovering up Orbán and people like that in Hungary to create a new world order. We are back to the 1930s. And within that structure, it is always the ordinary person who suffers. And part of the problem with the ordinary person is indifference and lack of information. And if you're in a post-truth universe and you hear an idiot like Michael O'Leary, the chairman of Ryanair, saying there's no such thing as climate change, somebody who's uneducated will go, well, maybe he's got a point there. Whereas there's no point whatsoever other than the preservation of his own business. Or somebody who doesn't have time will go, well, what the hell? He's talking crap, but I'll ignore it. But you can't ignore those things, because the reportage of that level of nonsense, creationism is the same way as Darwinism. There are 2 points to every side. There's no smoke without fire, balanced coverage, allowing or permitting any of that discourse. People who do that should be fired or shot in the non-shooting sense of the term. And giving legitimacy to the extreme right, giving legitimacy to the insane ramblings of fascists or neoliberals, the Republican Party of America, or some of the religious maniacs in Ireland, is giving credence to people who should have no credence attached to them whatsoever. And with Christopher Hitchens and other horsemen of the apocalypse in this, in my view, and Chomsky's, the triad of evil in the world is a combination of neoliberalism, extreme religious fundamentalism, whether that be Christian or Catholic or Islam is irrelevant from my point of view, it's the same thing, and post-truth, getting to people to believe the sweet poetry of Genesis, getting people to believe creationism, getting people to believe in trickle-down economics, getting people to believe it'll be all right tomorrow. Now, the point about innocence is innocent people believe this and or go along with it until they become dismissed and part of the establishment's problem. They're fine as long as they're compliant, but not if they threaten them. As long as you do what we tell you to do and do it for very little money, and we get all the credit, that's great. The minute you're disruptive, it's a real problem. Now, in this context, final concluding point on this, the Christian pastor Martin Langwallner, saying a lot about human innocence and human compliance in the 1930s, which is the phase we're at now, said, first they came for my friend and I did nothing. Then they came for my brother and I did nothing. Then they came for me. And it's time for the innocent people of the world to stand up against a fascist corporatocracy and to stand up against brutal state institutions. And the means necessary, I think, are becoming more and more radical. I'm still a liberal. I'm still a Burkean conservative liberal. I'm still a contrarian. I'm not a radical. But people have to understand that what's happening is extremism. And extreme neoliberals, extreme fascists, and extreme religious maniacs, and are in the toxic combination of all together, need to be opposed. So the commitment to innocence has become kind of complicated.
Great. It was.